Welcome everybody to Pass the Test. This video is going to be going over agency relationships, the single agency relationship, the dual agency relationship. We are even going to cover some non-agency relationships that you'll have, that you may have or your broker may have with clients or customers. So let's just keep it simple. Let's just talk about single agency relationship. And this is the foundation of really the stuff that you need to know. Because really, I tell people the agency relationship, and I just like to cut to the chase. This is really the agency relationship that you're going to create to help you make money in real estate. All right. And you need to know what duties that you owe people when you're creating these relationships and how these relationships are being created. So the first type of agency relationship that I want to talk about is a single agency relationship. All right. Now, what does a single agency relationship means? That means that you're representing either the buyer or the seller, not both. All right. You can have a relationship with a buyer or a seller, and it's called a single agent relationship. How do you get into a single agency relationship with a seller? Well, you may get word from somebody that someone wants to sell a house. It might be a family member. It might be someone that you met through marketing efforts. It might be somebody that you may have cold called or got some sort of lead or information that they wanted to sell their property. You would meet with them. You would explain to them what you're going to do for them. You would provide the necessary disclosures before you would enter into any type of relationship with them, and you would tell them that you're going to do one thing. You're going to bring them a willing and able buyer, all right? And you're going to bring them that buyer and they'll be ready to purchase the property. That's your job, to find a buyer for them. And that's a single agency relationship. Another way you can enter into a single agency relationship is that you may come across someone that wants to buy a house and they ask you to help them find the property. And your job is you're being hired to help find this person a property for purchase. It could be an investor, it could be a first-time home buyer, but your job is to help find them a house, and bring them to a house that they ultimately purchase. Those are single agency relationships. Again, a single agency relationship can be done with a seller only or a buyer only. A single agency relationship. All right, you have a relationship, and it's going to be created through some document, maybe in the buyer broker agreement or some sort of listing agreement. The next type of relationship that you can get into when you're dealing with real estate transactions is you can get into what we call a dual agency relationship. And let me bring up the screen with the dual agency relationship. I want to share my screen and just show you the two main things for the test that you want to remember about dual agency. The two main things, there's multiple things that you want to know about with dual agency and dual agency, is that it should be, you should obtain written consent, and the parties have to consent to it in writing that they're entering into a type of relationship. Avoid conflicts of interest. You don't want to be disclosing any information from either party to the other. All right, no side should have an added advantage in the transaction, and you want to remain neutral. All right, and that's just cut and dry. And it's really just common sense. If you're representing two people, it's very hard, number one, to represent two people. But if you are, you want to keep their information confidential. You don't want to be telling one party's information that was confidential from another party, and you want to avoid any conflict of interest with dual agency. So what is dual agency? You're representing the buyer and the seller. It should be in written consent, and you should get written consent. They should be agreeing to it. You want to avoid conflicts of interest and stay neutral throughout the transaction. Another type of agency relationship is designated agency, or what we call an in-company split. This is also a dual agency relationship, but it's more of a dual agency relationship with the broker. All right, where the broker has the buyer and the seller being represented by different agents of that brokerage. Okay. So the buyer and the seller will be represented by different agents in that same brokerage, and that's called designated agency. One is designated to represent the seller, one is designated to represent the buyer. That's an agency relationship where the broker is a dual agent. And each agent in the transaction would be identified as representing the seller, one representing the buyer, but it's under the same roof, if you will, or under that same brokerage. All right. Now, There are some instances where you'll be working with a buyer and a seller, but you don't have any agency relationships with them. And those types of agency relationships is what they call a transaction broker or a facilitator. There is no contractual agreement that I'm going to be representing either party. I'm just going to be like the conductor in this transaction where I'm going to provide copies, and I'm going to, maybe discuss some benefits of this or benefits of that. But by no way do I have a agency relationship where it's a signed agreement. I'm just going to be there to navigate the transaction as a facilitator or a transaction broker. You do not have a contractual relationship with that person, and that's the difference between that's a relationship where there's no agency relationship in it. And then we also have to talk about sub-agency. Sub-agency, I'll put that down here somewhere. Let me go to the sub. It might be up here. Sub-agency. Where is sub-agency at? But sub-agency is pretty. I always give the example where you don't have a direct relationship. It's not on here. I just must have didn't write it down. But you don't have a direct relationship with the seller or the buyer, but through another agent, you have a relationship through them. I get an example. Let's say, for instance, I'm going out of town and I need an agent here to watch after a listing or show some of my buyer clients properties. I would trust in that agent that would be here while I was out of town to perform some of the duties that I would owe the seller or a buyer in those examples I just gave. So that would create a sub-agency relationship. The most important thing about a sub-agency relationship, you have to get consent of your client to have that person be the sub-agent. So I just like to keep this stuff simple. Know the different agency relationships: single, dual, designated. Know the non-agency relationships and being a transaction broker or a facilitator. Some of the questions that you would run into about agency relationships, dual and single agency relationships would be here. Let me go ahead and pull these up. Give me 1 second. Let me pull some of these questions up for you. All right, here's a couple here. So on the test, you might see a question that says, "What does a single agency relationship involve in real estate?" All right, this answer or this question will have 4 multiple choice answers, but we don't need those. We can speak to this without seeing them. What does a single agency relationship involve in the real estate involve? What does that involve? Well, a single agency relationship means that, and this is what you would be thinking along the lines of this. And if you're not thinking this when you hear that question, then you need some more studying, or you need to go and get some more studying. And as soon as I hear single agency relationship, I'm thinking I represent either the buyer or the seller. That's the first thing I'm thinking. And when I represent the buyer or the seller, if it's the seller, I'm helping them sell the house, and if it's a buyer, I'm helping to find a house to buy. I'm going to be doing one specific thing, and that's going to be my job, depending on if I'm representing the seller or the buyer. And it's going to, and the way that I'm going to get into this relationship with the seller is either through a listing agreement, one of those types of listing agreements, and the way that I'm going to get into this relationship with the buyer is through some type of buyer broker agreement. All right, those are the documents that's going to create that relationship, and that's going to outline my duties that I owe, number one, to the client, and also what they're obligated to do as well. So single agency relationship means that I'm representing one, either the buyer or the seller, not both. And I'm hired to do one specific thing when I'm in that relationship. And it's going to be outlined either by a buyer broker agreement or a listing agreement. The next question: what is the primary obligation of a buyer's agent in a real estate transaction? Really, primary obligation is to find that buyer a house that fits their criteria. All right. And that's a pretty simple question, but you're gonna find that buyer a house based on the criterias that they gave you in terms of what they're expecting or what they're looking for in the property. And you'll find it as quickly as possible and as close of a match to what their expectations are. All right. So those are some single agency questions. Let's look at some dual agency questions here. It's a bunch of dual agency questions. Like here's one. And mainly what you're going to want to know about the dual agency is just what I said, the consent. It has to be in writing and it has to be disclosed in writing and it has to be consensual. So that's what they're really going to test you on. Know the definition of dual agency and know that it needs to be in writing and that both parties have to consent and in writing. So let's look at the first one. What is the requirement for dual agency relationship to be legally established in real estate? Has to be in writing. Parties have to consent, and the part it has to be disclosed to the parties that this is the relationship that they're entering into. All right, that's number one. Number two, what is ethically required for a broker to represent both the buyer and seller in a transaction? That goes back to consent, disclosure. It needs to be in writing. Let the parties know what's going on with what they're signing up for. Here's another one. A broker is asked to represent both the buyer and seller in the same transaction. What is most appropriate? I'm going to get the consent from both the buyer and the seller. I'm going to get it in writing, and I'm going to disclose that this is the relationship that we're creating. All right, those three questions is the same answer to each question. An agent represents both the buyer and the seller in a transaction. They uphold their duty to uphold their duty of loyalty. That the agent must ensure that neither party's confidential information is disclosed. There's no conflict of interest, and you're protecting the parties. You're not representing one more than the other, and you're not disclosing any confidential information. Now, with these questions, you would get four answers, and it'll be an answer that's going to be closely related to what I just said. But you need to be able to talk about these things like I am before you go take the test. If you can't, then I'm not saying you need to know it, to the 10th degree, but you need to be able to have a discussion about what that question is saying. And if you can, you should be able to pick, because you're going to have multiple choice on the test. So if you can just sit here and have a discussion about it, you should be able to pick one of the answers that's the correct answer. Number six, a real estate agent is representing both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. What is the most appropriate action for the agent to take to comply with dual agency requirements? It's consent in writing, and it should be disclosed. We're going to go back. We're going to get back to that pretty much on every question. They're going to make sure that you have to consent in writing, that it has to be disclosed to both parties, and it's consented to by both parties. All right. And I don't need to go over any other dual agency questions because it's all going to come back to that. So no dual agency. I think I might have some designated broker questions in here. Like this is just a definition question for sub-agency. What does sub-agency refer to in real estate? Just know the definition of sub-agency. They're not going to really try to test you a whole lot on sub-agency. I would just know the definition of sub-agency for the test. All right, that's termination of agencies, exclusive agency relationship questions, general agency, executory contract, exclusive right to sell. But those are just some basic questions about dual agency and single agency. Ultimately, agency is what relationship that you're creating with the person who's hiring you to perform a certain task. All right. It could be single agent when you represent the buyer or the seller, not both. Or dual agency when you represent both. It has to be in writing and both have to be consent to it and it needs to be disclosed. Right. You have designated agency where two agents for the same broker are one representing the buyer, one representing the seller. All right. In company split. Sub agency, just know the definition of sub agency. All right. You have some non-agency relationships, which is facilitators and transaction brokers. They don't have any agency relationships. So know those things for the test. You'll be questions about these on the test. You have about 10 to 11 questions from agency that's going to be on the test. And we have to get about 85 to 90% on the test to really, really feel good about getting to a point where we're going to pass the test. So that's some information about agency. This will end this video. Good luck with your studies. Good luck with the test. This will end the video.